Please don't do that. A paragraph.
You are much more important. What you have to say is much more important than what I'm saying. But I want you to give you a little background on Mr. Jordan. He is with the Black Scroll Network History and Tours Group and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the Detroit chapter. Mr. Jordan is an educator, writer, historian. He's been a teacher of African and African American history for over 15 years and a researcher of Black history for decades. After teaching in public schools for 10 years, he now runs the Black Scroll Network History and Tours, where he leads lecture tours and gives presentations dealing with African and African American history, especially African American history in the Detroit area. As part of this work, he leads sites of Detroit's Underground Railroad, important sites connected to historic neighborhoods of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, and Black historic sites throughout the city, including the cultural center sites of two of his institutional partners, the Detroit Historical Museum and the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and Detroit's Black Historic Music Site. We've given hundreds of tours for schools, for different organizations, taught in classes, gone to classes at Wayne State, University of Michigan, obviously, not just our class, our school, Michigan State, and NYU. Very active in the work on local history and African American history in general, and has served as the president of the Detroit branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In addition to providing history tours and presentations, Jamon Jordan writes for two publications of the Historical Society of Michigan, Chronicle and Michigan History for Kids, where he has written about Detroit's role in the Underground Railroad, as well as the history of Motown records and Detroit's history of riots and rebellion. Jamon Jordan is committed to African and African American history and teaching it to as many people who will listen. So we're really, really fortunate to have Mr. Jordan here. He was highly recommended by people who I trust and I know are good recommenders and have good judgment around these things, both as being an extraordinarily informed and knowledgeable person and also very engaging and interesting in terms of presentation. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, School of Social Work. Thanks, folks, for showing up. And I know some people are probably going to have to leave and go back to class, but I'm going to try to put as much information the time that you're here that I possibly can. And I want to be able to move as fast as possible to get to some questions or comments at the end. That's always challenging because it's always more information than it is time. So I'm going to do the best I can to make all these components of a presentation come together. So I'm here to talk about the history behind the '67 rebellion. And what you see there, that picture there, that's 12th Street on the first day, July 23rd, near dusk. So it's about to become dark. Near dusk on July 23rd, 1967, which was a Sunday, which is the first day of this 5-day rebellion. So today that street is named Rosa Parks. But anybody who's from Detroit, who's my age or older, still calls it 12th Street. No one my age or older calls it Rosa Parks. It was named, of course, in honor of Rosa Parks after the '67 rebellion. So the name got changed. And of course, Rosa Parks was living in the city of Detroit at that time and lived in the city of Detroit until she passed away. And she had been in Detroit since 1958. So a couple of years after the Montgomery bus boycott, she moved to the city of Detroit. And she didn't live far from the neighborhood where the rebellion began. So that's the street. And as you can see, stores have been looted. You can't see, but some stores are on fire. But you can't see that yet but from this picture. But some stores are on fire already. And at this point, already 3 people have been killed. So just within the first day. But who am I? We already had an introduction of me, but that's me 20 years ago. Anybody want to take a guess at where I'm at? There's always somebody in the crowd that kind of knows, but every now and then I don't get anybody. Okay, so I'm down south. I'll give you a hint. I'm down south. I'm not in Detroit. I'm not in this area at all. I'm down south. All right. So I'm in Atlanta, and I'm on the. Okay, I'm in Atlanta. That's a hint. Yes, I'm at Martin Luther King Jr.'s house, his childhood home. I was in college. I didn't know that one day I was going to be leading tours and stuff, but I was in college and I was doing on my spring breaks. I would go to these historic sites, these Black historic sites, and learn about these Black historic sites. And I subliminally I was doing research, but I didn't know that's what I was doing. But that's what I was doing. And so now, of course, this is what I do. But 20 years ago, I was learning what I am doing now. So that's me as a college student on my spring break in 1994. 1994 on spring break. And so then as a teacher, I started a study group. I co-founded. I was not the founder alone. There was another co-founder with me. We founded the Black Scroll Study Group, and we had classes on different topics of African American and African history, and we went to historic sites. Every year we would go to a historic site that we had been doing research about, and then we go to that site and continue that research, and then bring back our findings and research to the others who didn't go on the trip, and to other teachers and to students. And so, and of course, the plan was to publish all of this research, which we have yet to do. But that was 2011, and we were in D.C. And I know they're saying, "Won't he shut up?" And I am the president of the association, the Detroit branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And of course, that organization was founded in 1915 as the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And it was founded, of course, by Jesse Moreland and Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And that organization, of course, 11 years after being founded, found Negro History Week, which today is Black History Month. So I'm the president of the Detroit branch of that organization. And there are members here at U of M. So there are a number of professors here at U of M who are members of our organization. And anyone can join. And so now, today, most of what I do has to do with my company, Black Scroll Network History and Tours. And I lead tours and presentations like I'm doing today about African and African American history. And so for the last 4 years, this is what I've been doing. For the last 2 years, I've been doing this exclusively. So the first 2 years of the business, I was also teaching. So I was in a classroom and doing this. But now, this is all I do. And so there's my information. It'll come up again later. So if you want to take a picture later, or if you're really quick and you want to take a picture now, you can get that there, because I know I don't have enough cards for everyone here at the end. But if you take a picture of that, you'll have my contact information in case you want to do a tour, a presentation, you have a family reunion, whatever you got, I can work with you. Because the other thing is, I'm not going to be able to tell this whole story of 67 today. And if you email me, you can I can send you a list of my upcoming presentations, and maybe at one of those presentations you can get the rest of the story. Now this is going to go up again at the end. So how do we understand 67? One thing you have to do is you have to read. Now I know you're probably tired of hearing that. Professors probably always telling you got to read this, you got to read this. I remember, of course, my college experience, and I'm sure it's probably gotten even more extensive than it was in my day. And that was, we would have on our syllabus, read page 1 through 220 by the next class meeting. And so I show up at the next class meeting, and we weren't even talking about that book. The lecture would be something about something else. So I read this 1 through 220. Wouldn't have any discussion about that in class because the lecture was something about something else. But all of that is going to show up on the quiz, on the test. So I'm sure it's even worse. Well, maybe it's better now, but you must read. But you also have to read. So you have to read American history books, and this is one. It's a basic American history book. It's not something, a volume of 999 pages. But you have to read a basic African American history book too. And this is on a middle school level. It's not, and you don't have to be this book, but I just put this here as a basic African American history book. Everybody needs to have a basic understanding of African American history. Not just African Americans need to have a basic understanding of African American history. Okay, we all need that. You got to read a basic sociology book, and I didn't bring one of those. But you have to read some books on Detroit's history. Now, this one, as you can see, has gone through a lot, but it is a very valuable tool. I use it all the time, as you can see. But this is the Detroit Almanac. It's published in 2001. They updated it in 2006. It has a lot of dates, people, and it allows you to connect dots and the connections between people, events, and places. And so it's very important to have this resource if you really want to have a historical and cultural understanding of Detroit. But along with this book, you have to have a book on African American history in the city of Detroit. Now, Black Detroit by Herb Boyd was just published. Very good book. Gives you that basic information about Detroit's African American history. This one was published a little earlier, and it covers a lot of the same ground, except it's separated by like a calendar. So on January 1st, it shows all these different events and people and places that are important in African American history in the city of Detroit on January 1st. And then each day you can go through this history. So this is a very important book. Ken Coleman has published a number of books about Detroit's history. And I'll talk about other sources later. But of course, another very important thing you got to do, particularly for 67, you got to talk to people who experienced the history. There are people who were there, who are still living, who you can talk to. Not only are there people who were there who you can talk to who are still living, the Detroit Historical Museum has done oral, they've recorded and taken oral histories of people. Some you can hear, and then some you can just read the oral histories of people who were living. So even as these people are getting up in age, and some of them are, of course, have passed away already since they've done the oral history. Some of them have passed away already. You can read that history of people who were on the block, people who were around the corner, people who owned stores on those blocks, people who were officers, police officers, people who were firemen, people who were National Guards people who were activists. You can, all of those people or segments of each one of those communities have their oral histories, and the Detroit Historical Museum is still collecting oral histories. So the last time I went on last month, there's already more history since I've been on the site, and that was last month. So they've already accumulated at least 20 more people since the last time I checked, and that's only been a month. So there's more and more history being added to the oral history. It's Detroit67.org, I think is what it is. But you can find it by going to Detroit Historical Museum's website because they have a link to it. And you can read, most of them aren't recorded. There are a few that you can listen to, but most of them you can read the oral histories. So you have to, that's a way of talking to people too who have experienced that history. So what happened in 67 for those 5 days? Of course, you've probably heard all of these terms before. The one you probably heard the most is riot. So 1967 in Detroit was a riot. Or some people put a plural as if there was more than one. The riots, the 67 riots, it was only one in the city of Detroit. It was a 5-day riot. If you call it a riot, it was a 5-day riot. It wasn't the riots, but people call it that. But it's a form of civil disorder commonly characterized by a group lashing out in a violent public disturbance against authority, property, or people. So that's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of riot. And definitely it fits. That did happen in those 5 days. The other term that you may have heard, civil unrest or civil disorder or civil disturbance, that's a broad term, and it is a law enforcement term. So it means unrest that is caused by a group of people, which does apply to those 5 days, but I want you to consider the source. That term is a law enforcement term. That's how it enters the conversation. It enters the conversation from law enforcement, all right? And then, of course, the other term, rebellion, and then synonyms for it are uprising or insurrection, is a refusal of obedience and a resistance to the established authority. It originates from a sentiment of indignation and disapproval of a situation, and then manifests itself by the refusal to submit or to obey the authority responsible for this situation. Now, it's a couple of things I'm not going to do. I'm not going to argue about the term riot or rebellion, because A lot of discussion this last year has revolved around that. And what it is, what I consider it at this point, is it is a diversion to talk about it. So we talk about the term. We're having a meta discussion about 1967. We never talk about 67 because we're talking about the term of what we want to call it. So I do not debate what term we use, except in one instance. And I'll get to that in a minute. But when it comes to these three, they all apply. I use the term rebellion, and I'm going to, in this presentation, let you know why I use the term rebellion. But I don't get mad at people who use the term riot, and I don't get mad at people who use the term civil unrest. So if you came here to have the debate on what we're going to call it, I'm not going to be a part of that debate. You're going to be debating with yourself because I don't debate what we call it, except in one instance, which I'll get to in a minute. But I do want to say that there are reasons why people choose the different terms, and I'm going to share the reason why I use the term rebellion. And of course, some people point to race, the race of the person talking, and there's a slight correlation with race, not a strong one. So it's very slight, the correlation with race. There are African Americans who call it a riot and rebellion, and there are whites who call it a rebellion, and others that call it a riot. So the correlation with race is not as strong. Correlation with activism is a strong one. But really the correlation is, what are the people discussing, or what are they focusing on? If they're focusing on the 5 days, they tend to call it a riot. If they focus on what caused the 5 days, they tend to call it a rebellion. And since I'm a historian, I'm focused more on the decades of history that precede those 5 days. I'm more likely going to call it a rebellion. While some people are talking about just what happened in those 5 days. They're not talking about what happened in the 1930s and 40s in the city of Detroit. They're talking about what happened to their store. You know, what happened to my house? What happened to my son? You know, what happened to my daughter? They're talking about that. What happened to my window? And if you focus on that, you're probably more likely to call it a riot. But so most people do refer to July 67 as a riot. But if you refer to it as a rebellion, don't feel like that's revisionist history. And during and after 1967, most mainstream media, policymakers, they refer to it as a riot, and even to this day, they still do. More people do refer to it as a rebellion than before, but it's still most likely going to be called a riot by the news, by most scholars. They still use the term riot. At the same time, many radical activists, particularly those within the black community that were a part of the Black Power movement, referred to it as a rebellion back then, and they still do. Reverend Albert Clegg called it a rebellion. James and Grace Lee Boggs called it a rebellion. Milton and Richard Henry called it a rebellion. H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael called it a rebellion. They called it a rebellion back in 67. So it's not revisionist history that there are people calling it a rebellion now. There were people calling it that back then as well. Although I refer to it as a rebellion, again, I don't have any quarrels with those who refer to it as a riot, but there are, I'm going to explain why I call it a rebellion, but real quickly, there's a connotation to the term riot. When we hear the term riot, we think, even though that's not the dictionary definition, we think mindless violence. People destroying and killing people for no good reason. All right? Death and violence and destruction for no good reason. You can have a riot because Michigan lost to Michigan State. I mean, you can have a riot because your football team loses or wins. You can have a riot when they win too. You can have a riot because you are having fun. I mean, you can be. It cannot be because you were upset about anything. It can be because you be happy about something. Every year, somewhere in the South, there's millions of dollars worth of destruction, a lot of violence, sexual violence, and physical, non-sexual physical violence. Also, deaths. Numerous arrests, millions of dollars worth of property damage. It's never referred to as a riot. You know, the spring break. One of the reasons why many would argue that it's not called a riot is because of the group of people who are participating in it. And so there are things that meet the definition of a riot that are never called riots because people want to stay away from the connotation, not the dictionary definition, because it does match the dictionary definition, but many people are cognizant not just of the dictionary definition, they're cognizant of the connotation. Riot just sounds like mindless violence. And so they don't want to use that for certain groups of people. Right after the United States was founded, you had a couple of uprisings. They were really riots. Bacon's rebellion, the whiskey rebellion. But there is no time when African Americans, except when they're fighting slavery votes, but anything out of the slavery vote, after the slavery votes, is never referred to as a rebellion. Always referred to as a riot, every single time. So what didn't happen? What didn't happen is it wasn't a race riot. 67 was connected to race. Race is all a part of what happens in 67. But it was not a race riot. That's the only term I will debate people about. It's not a race riot. A race riot, and Detroit has had those too, is when people attack each other solely on the issue of race. Whites are attacking black people because they're black. Black people are attacking white people because they're white. That's a race riot. People's buildings are being destroyed because it is something that belongs to the opposite race. That's why a building is getting destroyed. In 67, the first person to be shot was a white alleged looter. Who shot him? A white store owner. That would never happen in a race riot. Detroit had its largest one in 1943. There were no white looters looting white businesses in 1943 because that doesn't happen in a race riot. Detroit has had them. 67 was not one. There's the 43 race riot, a picture of it. That's Woodward Avenue. If you know Detroit, that's Woodward. That's Midtown. That's the Bonsdale Theater today. It used to be the Bethel Temple, Bethel Congregation. And you see the queue line, the streetcars going down the street. And of course, what's happening in this crowd is African Americans are being pulled off of those streetcars and being beaten. And in some cases, they're going to be beaten to death. And the people are watching the streetcars looking for African Americans on the streetcars so that they can pull them off and beat them. In that race riot, 34 people will be killed. 9 whites, 25 African Americans. Out of the 25 African Americans who are killed, 17 of them are killed by the Detroit Police Department. No whites are killed by the Detroit Police Department in the 1943 race riot. There are some similarities between 43 and 67, but of course there are some differences. In the 9 whites who were killed, they're killed by African Americans. And they're killed when they go into Black Bottom, which is the African American residential community. It is war. It is a race riot. People are attacking people over race. Whites who come into the black neighborhood are in danger, and that's what happened. In fact, one we know for a fact is innocent. There were whites who came into Black Bottom looking for trouble. So that did happen as well. But in this case, we know that at least one of them was innocent, and he was a doctor who was making a house call. And his car was lit up when he came into Black Bottom, and he was killed. Of course, many African Americans were killed as they were coming home from work on the streetcars. They found out it was a race riot after they got off work because there was no 24-hour news in those days. You didn't get a little text on your phone to tell you what's going on. You didn't find out in some cases till the streetcars got right into this neighborhood. And then by that time, for many people, it was too late. They were pulled off of those streetcars and beaten. So that's the 1943 race riot. That's Michigan Avenue. He's in the custody of the police who are allegedly protecting him. And of course, this man is on Woodward Avenue, Woodward and Mack, in front of the Cunningham's drugstore, which is now Starbucks. And these two young men who they have been maligned in history. So when I show this picture, I have to adjust history. Because when people see this picture, they think that they are the ones that beat him. They're actually the ones that saved his life. All right. There are two, they're not Detroiters. They left on leave from the Army. It's World War II. It's 43. They're on leave from the Army and they're going to visit Detroit. They got here and a race riot started while they were here. And they were on Woodward and saw a crowd beating this man to death. They had put him off the streetcar and they were going to kill him. They were in the process of killing him. And these two men stepped in between the crowd and the man and saved his life. And after the crowd dispersed, this young man began to wipe off the blood, but that cloth is not enough to wipe off the blood. As you can see, the cloth is filled with blood, and it's nowhere else to put all that blood. And even though it looks just weird how they took that picture, they actually did save his life. And that's Cass Corridor, the most dangerous area for African Americans during the race riot in 1943. And there, as we can see, what was happening. The first race riot in the city of Detroit is 1863, though, and it's less known than 1943. And that race riot kind of destroys the myth that we sometimes get in the state of Michigan, that Michigan was the Union state. And we were anti-slavery, and we were pro-emancipation, and we were anti-Confederate. Not so fast. So, of course, Dr. Taya Miles has already published her book, Dawn of Detroit, which, of course, tells us that Detroit had slavery. So before we even talk about the fact of any type of underground railroad in Detroit, you had slavery in the city of Detroit. And many of those founders of Detroit, those early so-called founders of Detroit, French and British, European founders of Detroit, they're slave owners. Now, and when the French would lose Detroit to the British, many of the French residents, the wealthy French residents, now under British control, will become part of the British government in Detroit. So they were French wealthy folks, owned farms, owned businesses, were traders. They had textile, they had lumber, they had fur. When the British take over, they will become the British governmental officials. They're French, but they work for the British. Then when the United States takes over, those British and French governmental and wealthy folks will become American officials. They will be the first mayors, the first city council people. So the foundation of Detroit was set by many people who were slave owners. So when we talk about if you're in Detroit, you've been on St. Antoine, you've been on Beaubien. Antoine Beaubien was a slave owner. You've been on DeQuinder, on the DeQuinder Cut. Louis DeQuinder is a slave owner. You've been on Joseph Campbell, John R. Williams, his nephew. They're all slave owners. George McDougal, these are slave owners. You have 18 streets in the city of Detroit named after slave owners. And we have monuments to slave owners in the city of Detroit. We don't have Confederate monuments in Detroit, but we got slave owner monuments. So Detroit was not pro-slavery. The oldest still existing business in the city of Detroit during the Civil War was a Southern sympathizer. The oldest still existing business was founded in 1831 by Joseph Campbell and his nephew, John R. Williams, two slave owners at the time when they found this oldest business in the city of Detroit, which still exists. When it was founded, it was the Democratic Free Press and Michigan Intelligentsia. You know it as the Detroit Free Press. It's a newspaper. It is a Democratic newspaper. During the Civil War, it sided with the South. It was anti-Lincoln, it was anti-emancipation, and it was anti-black. And they wrote articles after article attacking black people and attacking Lincoln for even fighting the South. And in 1863, when Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, the Free Press goes into a hyper mode of attacking Lincoln. And they basically say, because of Lincoln, these people are going to come to the city of Detroit. And the Free Press did not say these people. These people are going to come to the city of Detroit. They're going to live next to you. The horror. They're going to steal your jobs. They're going to molest your women. Because that's what these people do. They molest your women, they take your jobs, and they're going to live next to you. Was that 1863 or was that 2016? Okay, but this is what the Free Press was writing. And in February of 1863, William Faulkner, an African-American saloon owner in the city of Detroit, will be arrested for molesting two young girls, an 11-year-old black girl and a 9-year-old white girl. And the Free Press, you already know. They said, see, we told you. This is what would happen. It's Lincoln's fault. He's drafting your children to fight in this godforsaken war. It's the first military draft in United States history. You're drafting your children to die in this godforsaken war for these people, and look what happens. Just what we told you was going to happen. And they did that, ran those kind of articles for a couple of days. Then after they ran those articles for a couple of days, they started running different articles. They said, William Faulkner is going to have his arraignment at City Hall. That's the original City Hall in the city of Detroit, built in 1835. It would get destroyed in 1871 when this City Hall was fully built. This is a picture a rare photo where both of them are still existing. So that's the old one. We call this the old City Hall. It's been destroyed. It was destroyed in 1952 when they built the City County building, which is now the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center. So we call this the old City Hall. So this is the old City Hall. And so the Free Press will write, William Faulkner's going to have his arraignment at City Hall, because there was a courtroom inside of there. He's going to be coming out of the north-facing doors. What are you going to do? And a group of people would be there, larger than the group we have right here, waiting on his arraignment. He will get arraigned on March 6th. He's going to plead not guilty. He says he pled not guilty. I didn't do this. And he comes out of the north-facing doors, and there's a crowd waiting for him at that park that many of you probably love downtown Detroit, Campus Martius. Who's been to Campus Martius? They got the ice skating rink up now. They're putting the tree up. In the summertime, they have the beach scene out there with a little beach bar. And then they have music playing, and even the name Campus Martius, it just sounds so beautiful. It means war camp. And that's what it was. And so they're waiting for him to come out. And as he comes out, they're going to give him a trial later for sending him to jail to await trial. They're going to give him the trial, and they're going to find him guilty, and they're going to execute him right there on that corner. And as he comes out, they start shooting. The minute he comes out the door, they start shooting. There's a armed militia that are taking him to the jail. And those bullets keep whizzing by the armed militia, and after a few of them whiz by, the armed militia shoot back into the crowd. And they shoot 2 people in that crowd, one of whom died. The crowd then realizes, if we keep doing this, we'll get them, but more of us will take some shots. So they leave, and they attack random African Americans. The first one, they beat to death. The next few, dozens of them, they beat, maim, and seriously injure, and they don't kill anyone, but nearly kill dozens of other people. They burn down 30 buildings, homes of black people, businesses of black people, including the saloon owned by William Faulkner, of course, and businesses that hire black people, and homes that are next door to African Americans because they don't allow anybody to put the fires out. So as they set a fire to an African American's home, any home next to it is going to get caught on fire because they don't allow anyone to put the fires out. And so now, not only do you have African Americans who have lost their homes and businesses, you have whites who have lost their businesses because of their proximity to African Americans. If you did not have 2 Detroits before March 6, 1863, you definitely have it after that. And you've had it ever since. There's been 2 Detroits since then. There were, of course, whites who were racist before this race riot in 1863, who never would have lived next to African Americans. But after that, even the whites who wanted to live next to African Americans didn't anymore. There were whites who wouldn't hire African Americans before 1863 because they were racist. But after this, even whites who had no problem hiring African Americans do now because they've seen what's happened. Some of them have lost their own businesses because whites have burned their businesses down for hiring African Americans. So the 2 Detroit model has expanded on a hyper level after March 6, 1863. That's the first race riot in the city of Detroit. And it, again, comes from the power of the pro-slavery forces in the city of Detroit, who were the powerful in the city of Detroit. They weren't the small people, they were the powerful people. So this is where the so-called riot, but the 67 rebellion starts on July 23rd. You probably have heard the story. It was a blind pig. Y'all heard that? They raided a blind pig, and a blind pig is in a what? A legal bar, legal after hours place. You've heard that. And I'm going to tell you that's all false. I'm not going to tell you that now, though. So there are three reasons why we get to July 23rd, 67. Three major forms of racism in the city of Detroit. One of them is unequal education. And that's still an issue today in our community. But it was an issue in 67 and it was an issue before 67. It begins when public school in Detroit begins. Actually, it begins before that. When we have common and free schools in Detroit. So the precursor to public schools were common schools or free schools. None of them allowed African Americans to be students. So African Americans would have to found their own schools at first. And when we finally get public schools in 1842, African Americans can't go. So Detroit public schools, when they're founded, African Americans are not allowed to be students in 1842. The South is practicing slavery, so they don't have segregated schools down south. It's slavery. Detroit doesn't allow African Americans to have schools, so African Americans have to start their own schools. But when they do allow African Americans to have schools, they're segregated, while the South is still practicing slavery. Much of what we call Jim Crow started in the North, not the South. We think of the 1950s and 60s when we talk about Jim Crow segregation. We think of the white and colored signs at the bathrooms, and we think of black people had to go to the back of the bus, and black people had to sit in the balcony, and they're not going to get served at the lunch counters. Much of that started in the North, not the South. The South was practicing slavery. They had no need for white and colored signs. It was the North that was they weren't practicing slavery because most northern cities and states would end slavery before the South. So they weren't practicing slavery, but they weren't practicing equality either. In the South, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment will be passed, they didn't want to practice equality either. And they will look to the North. What were you doing with black people? We were enslaving them. We know what we were doing. What were you doing, Boston? Oh, you didn't let them go to school with you. Oh, we'll check. Well, what were you doing, Philadelphia? Oh, certain jobs you didn't let them have. Oh, okay, check. Oh, what were you doing, Detroit? Oh, you don't let them live in the same neighborhood as you. So they were looking at what the North was doing, and these become what we call Jim Crow in the South, but the North was first. And so this is the first high school in the city of Detroit. If you didn't know, Detroit was the capital of Michigan before Lansing. And when the capital changes to Lansing in 1847, that old Capitol building becomes the first high school in the city of Detroit, Capitol Union School. And so there it is, the Capitol Union. You can't see the school because of the trees, but that's what that says. So they turned it into a school. When they expanded it in 1875 to make it bigger, they didn't tear down the old school. That concrete just covers that school. So that is just a coating, a concrete coating over this school. You walk up inside those stairs, you walk right inside that same door. That's what they did. And of course, this school did not allow African Americans. That ain't it. They didn't allow women, young women, girls to go either. So calling the public school is probably a stretch because the only people who could go were white boy students. That's it. It burned down in 1893. So that's a picture of the fire, after the fire, when it burned down. This was the historical marker that was there. It's gone now, but this is what it looked like. And there's their motto. There was a scale motto there to show us what it looked like. And this has all been destroyed because Capitol Park is a part of the development of downtown Detroit. And the major developer in that area owns most of the buildings that surround Capitol Park. And basically the city lets him do whatever he wants. And so he's destroyed, took down those markers, removed that stuff. And so, he's developing that to a smaller version of Campus Martius. That's what he wants. You may have heard of this guy named Dan Gilbert. The Capitol Park is in the Gilbertville section of Detroit. So African Americans, our first school was in Second Baptist Church. So Second Baptist Church is the first school for African Americans, founded by 13 black people who were leaders in the Underground Railroad. The faith leaders and the freedom fighters were the same people. in the 1800s for African Americans, those are the same people. So if you're looking for who is starting churches, they're the same people leading the Underground Railroad. Same people. You're looking for who's leading the Underground Railroad, the same people starting black schools. They're all the same people. So the abolitionists who are a part of leading the Underground Railroad, they're starting churches and they're starting schools, they're starting businesses. The first institutions are from this fight for freedom. And Detroit is no different. And so that the first school founded in 1839 by Second Baptist Church. And there's the marker that sits there. In 1839, they established the city's first school for black children. And there's my son. There's a member of Second Baptist Church. She will end up becoming the first African American public school teacher in the city of Detroit. Fannie Richards, who was well learned. She had studied, had tutors from all over the world. Her family was a well-to-do family in Virginia. As Virginia began to become more strict against free black people, she was from a free black family in the 1800s in Virginia. And Virginia began to become very restrictive. And basically, they're putting free black people in Virginia as close to slavery as possible. So many of them will leave Virginia. Her family will leave and come to the city of Detroit. And when they come, she's already been taught by people from all over the world. And she teaches at the Second Baptist School first, and then Detroit finally opens up a public school for African Americans. She gets hired there and realizes the schools are unequal. And that's a reality to this day, of course. And that is the real thing, even though we're talking about 67, and in this case, I'm talking about the 1800s, there's never been a time when African American students have had the same resources as white students if they weren't in the same place as those white students. Never been a time in America's history. So much of the fight for what we call integration, integrated schools, really wasn't about African Americans sitting next to white students. It was about them being in the same place where all those resources were available. Because there's no way ever in this country that is happened any other way. And so that's what happens here. She realizes that her school is unequal. And so she sues to overturn segregation. Not because she believes her students will do well if they sit next to a white student, but if they're in the same school with the same resources that the white students have, she believes they have a better chance at success. And so that's what she does. And so that lawsuit goes to the Michigan Supreme Court in 1869. The Michigan Supreme Court rules in her favor that segregated schools in Michigan are unconstitutional. She teaches at the first integrated public school in the city of Detroit, Everett Elementary. She teaches for 50 years. The Michigan Supreme Court never sends nobody to the city of Detroit, or Ann Arbor for that reason, to enforce their decision. So most schools in the city of Detroit stay segregated. Her school was integrated, but most schools, all the other schools in the city of Detroit were still segregated. Her school was integrated because she lived in the Lower East Side. Her school was in the Lower East Side, the area that will become known as Black Bottom. That was the area where African Americans were living, but it's also the area where all of the immigrants were moving into. So Germans and Jewish and Irish and Italians and Polish. So her area would be integrated. But the second and third generations of those immigrants will move out of that neighborhood. And African Americans will be stuck in that neighborhood. And so before she dies, her class is going to be almost African American. But within 10 years of her death, that school is all black. There's Miller. Miller High School becomes the main high school in the Lower East Side in Black Bottom, the neighborhood, the historic African American neighborhood known as Black Bottom. When the building is built, it was the main elementary school. Middle school, main middle school in Black Bottom. The Duffield was the main elementary. Miller was the main middle. Eastern High School on Mack and the Boulevard. In Detroit, we say the Boulevard, but you might know it as Grand Boulevard. If you say the Boulevard, we know you from Detroit, or you know somebody really closely from Detroit. If you say Grand Boulevard, you're still okay. If you say Grand, we know you ain't from Detroit. Because nobody in Detroit calls that street Grand. It's the Boulevard or Grand Boulevard. So the Eastern was on Mack and the Boulevard, and it was the main high school in the Lower East Side. By the time we get to the 1930s, you got all these African Americans moving in that area. And the white parents said, we don't want our kids going to high school with these Negroes. They weren't so mad about the elementary school. It's okay for them to mingle there. They wasn't even all that mad about the middle school. Okay. But you can probably guess what the problem was about high school. You probably can put that together. So they didn't want their children to go to high school. So Detroit Public School would come up with a ruling in 1933 to turn Miller Intermediate School, the junior high, to a high school. African Americans who live in the Miller area will go to Miller. Whites who live in the Miller area will be allowed to transfer to Eastern High School, finish up their middle school, and finish high school also at Eastern. African Americans would not be allowed to transfer to Eastern. The ones who are at Eastern, they'll trickle through, but no new people. And from 1933 to 1957, this is the black high school, and Eastern is the white high school in the same neighborhood, in the city of Detroit. We ain't talking about Mississippi. This is Detroit public school policy. This ain't Detroit versus Bloomfield or Birmingham either. This is in the same district, in the same neighborhood, the schools are segregated. From 1933 to 1957, Miller is the black high school. And of course, the second one is housing discrimination. So we talked about unequal schooling, but connected to schools inequality is housing. And Detroit had, when African Americans come from down south during the Great Migration to come to the city of Detroit and get those jobs at Ford and then later GM and then later Chrysler, and then for a while it was about a dozen other auto companies too, the Hudson Motor Car Company, the Packard Motor Car Company. Dodge wasn't part of Chrysler yet. It was the Dodge. Dodge was its own auto factory. All these other auto factories, African Americans were coming and working at all of them. Ford was first to offer $5 a day for all workers. But African Americans would start working at all of these places and the suppliers to those places. When they come in here and they're making a better wage than they could ever make being sharecroppers and tenant farmers down south, which is just one step away from slavery. When they come here for that, they still run smack dab into Detroit's version of Jim Crow. No, it's not tenant farming and sharecropping, but it's definitely housing discrimination. Black people can't live wherever they want to live. They're concentrated primarily in Black Bottom. Some places in the city of Detroit have not created racially restrictive covenants, and that's the main form of housing discrimination. Racially restrictive covenants would be attached to a deed or in the deed itself, and it would say you can't rent, sell, or lease to a Negro. Sometimes a second group would be added. If a second group was added, it would be Jewish people. Jewish people, you can't rent, sell, or lease to them either. And so before places would add those into their deeds, a few African Americans had become pioneers in areas throughout the city of Detroit. So you had little sprinklings of African Americans throughout the city, but the concentrated area for African Americans was Black Bottom, the Lower East Side of the city of Detroit. Dr. Ocean Sweet don't want to live there, and that's him there. That's Dr. Ocean Sweet. He didn't want to live in Black Bottom because it's becoming run down because of segregation. Because you got all these people in an area that's really built for what, maybe 5 or 10,000 people. You've got 100,000 people living in this area. And so he's like, I don't want to live in this area that's got 10 times more people than it can contain. And so he buys a home on 2905 Garland in a house that has a racial restrictive covenant attached to it. Shouldn't even been able to buy the house. The person sells them the house anyway. There's a racist reason, of course, for racial restrictive covenants. People say, I don't want no black person living next to me, or I don't want no Jewish person living next to me. That's the reason. But the non-racist justification is if Negroes move next to you, your property value will go down, which is a myth. When black people moved in predominantly white neighborhoods, property values go up. Now, I know y'all like saying there's some black supremacist stuff this man's talking about. What are you talking about? When black people move in, it goes up. Now, I was with you till you said that. Okay, well, it's not black supremacy. When African Americans would move in, just like Dr. Ocean Sweet, they would be willing to pay more than what the house was worth to move into that neighborhood. If Dr. Sweet, if the home seller had sold that home to a white person and followed the racial restrictive covenant, they would have had to sell it for basically what the house was worth. But by selling it to Dr. Sweet, they charged him 3 times what the house was worth. And Dr. Ocean Sweet paid it. And this is the trend for African Americans who didn't want to be in Black Bottom. Those are the pioneers who are able to get into neighborhoods even with racial restrictive covenants because they're paying more than the house is worth. And people are willing to break racial restrictive covenants to sell it to them because for many people, capitalism trumps racism. And so the person sells it and is out of there. And Dr. Sweet moves in. Now, before Dr. Sweet moved in, this man, Dr. Alexander Turner, Dr. Sweet's friend, had tried to move in on the west side. When he tried to move in on the west side, the Tireman Improvement Association, which is the homeowners association in the old West Side neighborhood, visited his home. I call them the unwelcoming committee. They visited his home, they kicked in his door, and at gunpoint forced Dr. Alexander Turner to sell his house back to the housing, the homeowners association. And he had to move out. Now that's Dr. Sweet's friend. He knew what happened to his friend. Now he's moving into an area very similar. And why is he doing this? Dr. Turner paid nearly 2 times what the house is worth for the house that he moved into. When Dr. Sweet moves into his house because he knows what happened to his friend, he's there. His wife, Gladys Mitchell Sweet, is there. His brother, 2 of his brothers are there, and a few of his friends are there, and they're all armed. Everybody got a gun. And on the second day, when a crowd crosses the street, about 400 people, and they threaten to burn the house down, they're going to kill him and everybody in the house unless he gets out right now. And they then start throwing bricks through the window. All of a sudden, 2 shots ring from inside of the house into the crowd, shooting 2 people in that crowd. One of those people is going to die. The police who are in the crowd, too, come into the house and arrest everybody in the house. The local NAACP take up the case to try to save this man's life. They just think he's going to die. They think the Sweets are going to die. They're not really thinking he's going to ever get free, but they're just trying to save him from being killed. Because 1920 Detroit was nowhere you wanted to be for this and be charged with this crime, shooting 2 white people and killing one of them. And the national NAACP, James Weldon Johnson, would send in a legal team and would take over the case. And the leader of the legal team from the national NAACP would be Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow was told that the NAACP wanted him to argue against racial restrictive covenants. They wanted to make this a civil rights case to overturn housing discrimination. But Clarence Darrow comes into Detroit. He assesses Detroit. Yeah, okay. And after seeing what's the climate of Detroit, I never win a racial restrictive covenant case. So he argues something else, which we now call castle doctrine. A person has the right to defend their home without having to run from your own home. The first trial ends in a mistrial. The Sweet's brother, Dr. Sweet's brother. Then the second trial, they're all tried together, and they all are acquitted. And castle doctrine, yep. And that case is a landmark case, but it doesn't overturn any form of housing discrimination. Doesn't change anything about housing discrimination. That's the historical marker on the Sweet's house. There's a front and back to that marker. I'm not going to talk about all of this because we ain't got time for all of this, but there were 3 major Ku Klux Klan periods. This is the one that's important in Detroit's history. What you need to know is that in 1930, the KKK built a headquarters building, a 40,000 square foot building called the Castle, spelled with a K. They had this thing about Ks. And it was on 206 East Hancock, and that's John R. Hancock. In the 1920s, there were 40,000 KKK members in Michigan. Half of those lived in the city of Detroit. Now, just a little bit, when I was in Memphis, of course, I stumbled upon the home of Nathan Bedford Forrest. I was walking, and I saw the mark. I was like, what? Of course, Nathan Bedford Forrest, if you don't know, was the first grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Grand Dragon is a state leader of the Klan. The Grand Wizard is the head of the whole Ku Klux Klan. There are more markers and monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee than any other person in Tennessee, including 3 presidents that come from Tennessee. That's the monument I had to pass every day. That's the park that it sits in It was named Forest Park when I was there. They changed the name to Health Sciences Park now. And he's in there. Nathan Bedford Forrest is in the monument. So just that whole idea of, honor to these slave owners and racists. I'm going to move quickly through this. That's the Ku Klux Klan in the city of Detroit. Anybody want to take a guess at where they are? Maybe this might help give it away. The little brick wall posts like a gate. That might help you. They're at the State Fair, at the old State Fair. You may remember that old entrance if you were a Detroiter or if you've been to the old State Fair. On State Fair in Woodward, there's the old brick entrance and exit that used to be there. It's not there now, but it used to be there. And they're coming out of there, and they're going to lead a parade. It's not a march. It's a parade down Woodward, and they're going to burn a cross in front of the old City Hall. That's their mayor. If you didn't know, Detroit had a Ku Klux Klan mayor. And so that's him, Charles Bowles, elected in 1930. So the Ku Klux Klan had a mayor of the city of Detroit. When I give this presentation and other presentations like it in suburbs, and I say, you know that there was a very racist mayor of the city of Detroit. The people in the suburbs all say, Coleman Young, yeah, he's a racist. Coleman Young is a racist, that's right. They're surprised that I agree with them. And I say, no, I'm not talking about Coleman Young. And they're like, oh, we thought we had somebody who agree with us. And I say, no, there's a Ku Klux Klan mayor of the city of Detroit. Now, they all say that, not all, but many people in the suburbs when I give presentations, not everybody, but many of them say that Coleman Young was a racist. But they don't even know that it was a Ku Klux Klan mayor of the city of Detroit. His name is Charles Bowles, and that's him. So as you can see, that's not a march, that's a parade. All right? And so this is when 23 is Detroit. We don't have a picture of them on Woodward Avenue. 24 is in Adrian, Michigan. In 1925, they're in Grand Rapids. But the Detroit one was larger. So if this is the Grand Rapids one in 1925, Detroit was larger. So as you can see, that's not a march, that's a parade. And the same thing would happen. They would burn a cross each time at the City Hall. So in 23, Detroit City Hall. 24, Adrian City Hall. 25, Grand Rapids City Hall. They were the third most powerful entity in the city of Detroit. Number one were the auto factories, Henry Ford being the single most powerful person in Detroit. Number two, the Purple Gang. The people call them the Jewish Mafia. They're the second most powerful entity in the city of Detroit. Number three, the racist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and then the Black Legion, who will come right after them. And there's a New York Times best-selling book that recently came out talking about the history of the Black Legion, Terror in the City of Champions. Detroit has sundown neighborhoods. I mean, housing discrimination could be violent. It wasn't always just lawsuits. It would be deaths and beatings and all of those kinds of things too. And there were sundown neighborhoods. You may know of sundown towns. Sundown towns is black people got to be out of town by sundown. And when I was growing up, Dearborn was still a sundown town. And before you had sundown towns, you had sundown neighborhoods in the same city. So black people lived in Detroit, but they couldn't live everywhere in the city of Detroit. And there were some places in Detroit they couldn't be in when sun went down. One of them was the far southeast side between Black Bottom and Grosse Pointe. Another one was the Van Dyke area outside of Conant Gardens. The other one was the 8 Mile in Wyoming area where the wall was. And part of it still is. And the Grand Boulevard neighborhood, Motown is there now, but Motown wouldn't have been there in the 1920s. And certain streets in the East Midtown area, especially Ferry Street. But the most dangerous area for black people in the 1920s and 1950s was Cass Corridor. Cass Corridor was hands off. People in Black Bottom in the 1920s and 30s called Cass Corridor Cass-Tucky. Because just like black folks came from down south to work in the auto factories, so did whites. They came from down south too to have better jobs in the factories. And they brought their southern lifestyle with them. That's why you had that large Ku Klux Klan in the city of Detroit. And so many of them were in the Cass Corridor area. And that would be an area you didn't want to be in after dark, particularly. You could work there in the daytime, but after that, you got to get out of there. And that's where many African Americans got killed during the 1943 race riots. So there's the Black Legion. The Ku Klux Klan, they have names like Grand Wizard, Grand Dragon, Most Honorable Wizard, and all of that kind of stuff. The Black Legion has corporal, general, sergeant, lieutenant. They have military terms. They break off from the Ku Klux Klan. And these are a group of them that are going to get arrested. And they're going to get arrested for killing a white man who was a Catholic, who was a WPA worker. That's when they get arrested. Now, they've killed a bunch of people, but it's after they do that, that's when they get arrested, they get investigated. Dayton Dean is going to confess to killing Silas Coleman, a black veteran, because he was bored that day. That's Dayton Dean right there. In 1931, just 3 deaths, but they killed about 14 people. But in 1931, the father Malcolm X is killed in Lansing, Michigan. We believe that was the Black Legion. 1935, black soldier Silas Coleman was killed by Dayton Dean. 1936, Charles Poole, a white man who was Catholic, would be killed by members of the Black Legion. They're going to get arrested and investigated. And when they get investigated, we find out that they work in auto factories and for the city government. We're going to also find out that dozens of them were police officers. Before they were Black Legion members, many of them were KKK members. In 1925, and I keep saying I got to change this, 55 black people, not just men, were shot. They all didn't get killed. 55 black people were shot in Detroit by Detroit police officers. Now we know who many of those officers were. Many of them were members of the Black Legion, and before that, they were members of the KKK. This is the same year that Ocean Sweet refused to give up their house. So this is that time period. This is one of their recruiting stations, the Model T plant that Henry Ford set up in Highland Park on Woodward Avenue. And of course, in 1940, we get the Burwood Wall to separate the white community from the African American community. And now this is really not just individual racism. This is the federalization of housing discrimination. Because the federal government under the National Housing Act of 1934 is going to subsidize the building of homes throughout the country. Not only going to just subsidize the building of homes, the reason they're doing it is because of the Great Depression. Anybody who's a home builder can't sell it because who's going to buy a home during the Great Depression? Nobody has the money. People who have homes are in foreclosure, most of them. And so they can't afford to even keep their homes. So the federal government is going to subsidize the building of homes, and they're going to subsidize mortgages on homes. So that instead of having a 7 or 8% interest rate, you're going to have a 2% interest rate. So you're going to get that $10,000 house or $15,000 house or $20,000 house. You're going to splurge. Get you a $20,000 house. And in 15 and 20 years, you're going to pay the federal government back $22,000. It's money for money. Basically, if it were in today's time, they'd call it welfare. But it wasn't called that. So it was housing subsidy. The federal government was subsidizing these mortgages. But it was a caveat. The houses had to be in racially homogeneous neighborhoods. It means one race. So when African Americans tried to get these loans on their homes, the federal government said, nope, sorry. The FHA, which was founded under that same Housing Act, would say, no, you can't get it, because if you move there, it won't be racially homogeneous. It'll be black and whites living together, and we don't do that. So black people are like, okay, I got you, I hear you. I live in Black Bottom. Give me one of those loans in my all-black neighborhood. And the federal government put a red line around all the areas that do not give those loans out to us, where we get the term redlining from. It's an FHA term. The federal government creates this. This ain't racially restrictive housing covenants that a person put on their own deed and personally are practicing racism. This is the federal government institutionalizing racism and segregation, mainly in the North. Not only are they doing that, they're federalizing wealth inequality. Because within 20 years, that $15,000 and $20,000 house that the federal government gave you the money for is $100,000 now. You're going to use the equity of that and open up a little store. You're going to use the equity of that to send your kids to college. You're going to use the equity of that and buy a bigger home and leave that and get that other one to your children. You're going to pass down wealth because of what the federal government did for you. What were African Americans doing? Since they were unable to take advantage of one of the largest wealth growing periods in American history, the federal government gave them something. The federal government was progressive. They opened up federal housing projects. for African Americans. So African Americans were paying rent for all of their years at the Brewsters, at Cabrini Green, at the Robert Taylor Home, at the Igo Towers in St. Louis. That's what African Americans were doing. That was the same Federal Housing Act. National Housing Act of 1934 did that for whites and did federal housing projects for African Americans. There's a white property developer who's building houses. The federal government is subsidizing the building of those homes. So he's going to make the money because he's going to sell the homes to people who are going to get one of those federal housing grants. And so he's going to make money hand over foot. And the federal government says, stop, you can't do no more. Don't build another house. And he's like, why? Why I got to do that? We've just discovered that there are Negroes living not that far from here. Well, what had been happening? Black people have been coming from down south, got to Detroit, got to Black Bottom, and found out how crowded it was. They moved all the way to the far northwest side and built their own homes secretly. They ain't tell nobody. They just built their own homes, lean-tos, shotgun houses, shacks, whatever you want to call them, because they didn't want to be in crowded Black Bottom. If nobody knew they were there for over a decade. And so that's what they had been doing. And now, because the federal government's come with this plan, and they paying for these houses to be built, they're going to come to inspect the area. And they find out it's been black people living over here. And they tell him he has to stop. And he says, well, what can I do? I don't want to lose all my investment. What if I build a wall that separates my neighborhood, the white neighborhood, from the African-American neighborhood? The federal government said, yeah, that'll work. Make sure it's 6 feet. Make sure it's no streets that the African Americans can walk through, and make sure that every African American is out of that area by sundown. And that's what he does. And so the wall is from 8 Mile to Chippewa, a half-mile wall between the streets Burwood and Mendota on the northwest side of the city of Detroit. Parts of it still exist. That's how it looked when it was built. Today, some people in the community have created murals on a large part of the wall to try to redefine the way the wall looks, but they do want it there to testify that history. Because if I told you that there was a segregation wall in the city of Detroit, you wouldn't believe me. Some people would be like, you making that up. You're going too far. Now, I was with you till you said that Detroit had a Berlin Wall. Now you just went too far. So I'm glad that the wall is still there, because when I take people on tours and we go there, they can hardly believe. There's an emergency meeting in 1950, March 11th. All residents on streets DeQuinder, Marks, Orleans, Riopelle, Greeley, and all streets up to Oakland 6 Mile to 7 Mile Road, right outside of Conant Gardens. What's the emergency? Neighborhood invaded by a colored purchase on Orleans in Minnesota. Black people done bought a house. That's the emergency. Many block clubs, neighborhood associations, and then later city political machines are founded on racism. So it starts out in community organizing in certain neighborhoods. The community organizing isn't to beautify your block. It isn't to plant flowers. It's to keep black people out. When Orville Hubbard comes up with keep Dearborn clean, he's not talking about the streets. He's talking about keeping black people out of Dearborn. That's what it means. And so this is organizing. This is community organizing, which will create political machines in the city of Detroit. And the Sojourner Truth homes will be built in 1941 for African-American defense workers. The federal government is going to build these homes for African-American defense workers. So just being black ain't even good enough. You have to have a contract. You have to prove that you have a contract to work at a plant that is creating bombing or tanks for the United States government. And if you do, then you can apply to live in the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. You got to pay your deposit in January, and you can move in February. Well, the people in the neighborhood say, no, it's surrounded by an all-white neighborhood. And they say, nope, we're not going to let that happen. So they get the city to revoke the federal contract for African Americans to move there. And then black people have a protest. You can see it. Protest loss of Sojourner Truth homes. They had lost the home. Some people have already paid the deposit. It's January. They're supposed to move in February. Some people already paid the deposit. The federal government is going to get wind of it. And then they're going to direct the mayor, look, you got to do something. We need these workers. The federal government, sadly, civil rights advances many times during war. And the federal government needs African-American workers in these plants. And they tell the city, no, you got to let them move in. So The homes are given back to African Americans. And so now you see the other protests. That's the other flyer. Help the white people to keep this district white. Men needed to keep our lines solid. Come to Nevada and Fenelon, Sunday and Monday. Those are the two move-in dates for the African Americans. This is February now. We need help. Don't be yellow. Come out. We need every white man. We want our girls to walk on the street, not raped. That's the African Americans who are protesting when they lost their homes. That's the wall that's going to block them from moving in. So when they come to move in, it's February, so you know it's cold. It's Detroit, and they come in to move. Black people come to move in, and that wall repels them. Black people in Detroit are not known for nonviolent civil disobedience. They get there and can't move in. Oh, okay. Man, Tyrone, Lil Man, let's go. And they come back with their friends, their cousins, and some things that they have in their hand. And they coming to move in. And here they go. No, I'm sorry. This is the first day or the second day. The police go through the crowd of whites who are blocking them and tell them to go home, go home, go home. No one is arrested. None of the whites are arrested on those 2 days that they're blocking. And so that's what's happening here. The police are telling them to go home. This is what they think of the police. That's a police car. This is what the crowd thinks about the police. African Americans come back. As you can see, look at that. He's moving in. And who's blocking? Who's protecting? And they're going to arrest the African Americans. The police are going on the second day, when the African Americans come back, they're going to get arrested. The federal government is going to send the army in. And the army is how African Americans are finally going to be able to move in the middle of World War II. The army has to come to the city of Detroit to help African Americans move into a federally created housing project for defense workers. If you go back to the sign, the racists always pretend that they're the patriots. The housing is for federal defense workers. But no matter what African Americans do, they're never patriotic enough. It's the racists who are the patriots. They got the flag up there. The Minnie McGee, Orson and Minnie McGee, they move into a racially restricted house as well, and they do not pay more than what the house is worth. The house has a racial restrictive covenant, and they move in, and they don't pay more than what the house is worth. They pay the regular price, even with the racial restrictive covenant. If you take a look at the picture, you'll probably know why they were able to move in without having to pay more than everybody else. Look at Orso. Orso could pass for white. So he bought the house, and they didn't know they were selling the house to a black man. So they saw his wife out working in the lawn. And Mrs. Sipes, the next door neighbor, sees Miss McGee, Minnie McGee, working in the lawn, putting her garden together. They've been living there for months now because, it's cold when they moved in, and now it's starting to get spring, so she's starting to put the flowers out. You know how we do. And so she's doing that, and the next door neighbor says, are you the maid? Now, I don't even got to say what happened after that, because Minnie McGee said, and I like to put it the way I think she said it, you don't know, this is my house. I can't do it, but sisters, y'all know. But that's what she said. And then the Sipes sue. Sipes versus McGee. The Sipes sue to remove them from the home, because it's a violation of the racial restrictive covenant. They shouldn't have been able to buy the home once they realize they're black. This gets thrown into the Shelley versus Kramer lawsuit, goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1948. Thurgood Marshall is the lawyer. And of course, this is the lawsuit that says that the government cannot enforce racial restrictive covenants. Doesn't really say they're illegal, but it says you can't go get the sheriff to throw people out the house because of a racial restrictive covenant. But in most cases for racial restrictive covenants, that hadn't been what they had been doing anyway. In most cases, they weren't taking people to court. They weren't getting the sheriff. In most cases, they had another way of getting you out of the house. And so, 68, when the Federal Open Housing Act is passed, African Americans legally can move into wherever they want to move to. And so that old home they wanted to buy back in the 40s with the federal housing subsidies, they go to buy that house. and it's 200,000 now. So they got the right to move there, but it's an empty right because now they don't have the finances to move there. They haven't accumulated the wealth to be able to move there because they've been paying rent for 30 years. While the whites who got those federal housing grants have gotten the equity and have the wealth increase from that. The wealth gap between the African American and white community today, well, back up. The income gap is African Americans have 60% of the average income of the white average family. But the wealth gap, African Americans have about 5% of the wealth of white. Some people would trace that wealth gap all the way back to slavery. And that's fine, but you don't have to do that. You can go just about 80, 70 years ago from the Federal Housing Act. Much of this wealth gap is built on housing. When we're talking about housing discrimination, we're really talking about wealth discrimination that was institutionalized by the federal government. So there's the film about the McGee case. Lynn Whitfield plays Mrs. McGee, Minnie, and Linda Hamilton plays Anna Sipes. And this is the Ethel Watkins case in 1957. She moved to the northwest side of the city of Detroit, Schoolcraft and Telegraph neighborhood. She moves there. And the unwelcoming committee I told y'all about, y'all might not have believed me. Well, there they are, on her porch. You don't got to believe me. They're on her porch, and they're going to run her out of there, and she's going to have to leave. There's one of the racially restrictive housing covenants that said premises shall not at any time hereafter be sold, leased, or transferred to any colored person or persons, or to any person or persons of the Ethiopian or Semitic race. Jewish people are on this one too. These are two good sources for that time period. Black Bottom and Paradise Valley time period, Toast of the Town by Sonny Wilson, and $1 Million Worth of Nerve by Ken Coleman. Paradise Valley would be the business district for African Americans. Black people own 350 black-owned businesses in the lower east side of the city of Detroit. You've probably been to Paradise Valley. When you went there, it was Ford Field and Comerica Park. But that was the black business district in the city of Detroit. Much of downtown business development that's going on now, primarily by two billionaires, that would be African American business development if the federal government hadn't decided to give cities money to build freeways. And the city chose to build the freeway right through Paradise Valley, taking all of the land and businesses by eminent domain. The people who are having an uprising on 67, many of them lost their homes and businesses in Paradise Valley. And they remembered losing their homes and businesses in Paradise Valley. African American settlement around the city of Detroit follows Jewish migration around the city of Detroit, because Jewish people were the second group who were most likely to be discriminated against in these housing covenants. And so they would be the least likely to practice housing discrimination on the following group. So African Americans, that's Black Bottom, that's Paradise Valley, the North End, the Old West Side, Northwest Detroit, Oak Park, and Southfield. African Americans follow Jewish migration even into Oak Park and Southfield. That's why Oak Park and Southfield are predominantly African American, unlike Livonia and Sterling Heights. Even though same level economic, the economic situation in Livonia and Sterling Heights was similar to Oak Park and Southfield at the time the African Americans are moving into Oak Park and Southfield, but they can't move into Livonia and Sterling Heights. But they can move into Oak Park and Southfield because Jewish people had been there. That's Hastings Street, the main street for Paradise Valley, the black business district. That's Hastings Street. That's the Club 36, is one of the most popular clubs in Paradise Valley. One of the reasons Paradise Valley is so popular is because it's the pop music of the day, is swing, big band jazz. There's only one place in Detroit you can go hear that every single night, and that's Paradise Valley. So Paradise Valley is predominantly black in the daytime, stores, restaurants, clubs, candy stores, whatever. But at night, it's predominantly white in customers because they can afford to come there every night. That's the Forest Club, the largest club on Hastings Street, bigger than Madison Square Garden. So it's going to get destroyed. And now I'm going to the third and the last part of racism that helped to cause 67, and that's police brutality. And so police brutality had been a major problem in the city of Detroit from the 1920s to the 1980s. I've already told you what happened in 1925. By the 1960s, there's these units of 4 police officers, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. Uniformed officer as the driver, 3 plainclothes officers in the unmarked unit, known as the Big 4. And because it's 2 in the front and 2 in the back, they're not really keen on arresting you because they don't got nowhere for you to sit. So they handle you a different way. And when they would come onto a street, give us that corner. And you had to get off the corner. And if you didn't move fast enough, they would beat you. And they beat men, women, and children. Okay? And on July 5th, they killed Cynthia Scott on John R. and Mack. She was a well-known prostitute. She was known in that neighborhood, but the police claimed it was self-defense. They claimed she tried to cut them. Of course, most black people knew what the real deal was. The police were rolling them. Police rolled prostitutes. They take their money. And if you put up any kind of resistance, they beat you or kill you. And that's what happened to her. She shot twice in the back and once in the stomach. A week later, they're going to kill a young black man who was allegedly in a stolen car. There's Cynthia Scott. Here's the article about her. There's an editorial cartoon that says, if the requirement for becoming a policeman is the simple knowledge of gun firing, then any ignorant, hot-tempered person with the strength to pull the trigger is qualified. What we talk about, we could have had Black Lives Matter decades ago in the city of Detroit, and other places too, but we're talking about Detroit right now. So these are the long-standing issues: job discrimination, which I really didn't talk about, but unequal education, housing discrimination, and police brutality. And unemployment is also growing by the 1960s. That's Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., and of course that's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that's the March on Woodward. In 1963, there's Albert Clegg giving the speech before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Cobo Arena. But these were events that were recent for 67. In April of 1966, the students at Northern High School initiated a walkout, and they're protesting the racist curriculum and the inferior school resources. Community leaders are going to organize freedom schools for the students. And that's a mile away from where the 67 rebellion occurs. In August 1966, there's a planned rebellion in Kercheval on the east side in the city of Detroit. Young black men are planning to have a rebellion. Not like 67. They're planning this one. And it's mainly about the Big 4. And so they're going to stand on the corner, and that's what they do on that Friday night. And the police, the Big 4 roll through, give us that corner, and they don't move. And the Big 4, they're not known for really shooting first. They're known for wanting to beat you up because they're all big. So they get out the car to beat these young guys up. And 8 other young men join them on the corner. The Big 4 call in for backup. The tactical mobile unit is in the area because of a Vietnam War protest going on downtown. So the tactical mobile unit is there in 5 minutes. And then it starts pouring down raining. You cannot have a rebellion in a thunderstorm. And so that rebellion doesn't happen. Everything comes together for the police officers in 66. None of that stuff comes together for them in July of 1967. In fact, their success in 66 is part of the reason why they're so cocky in 67, and you end up with a 5-day rebellion. On June 12, 1967, Corrado Bailey is a black man living in Warren. His house is attacked by a white mob. It takes 3 days before the police respond. Why is this black man living in Warren? Warren is a sundown town in 1967. How did he get there? His wife is white. She bought the house. And so once the neighbors found out he was there, they attacked the home. The police take 3 days to show up. This is what people were talking about and thinking about in July of 1967. This was on their minds. There's Northern High School where the walkout happened. That's the corner where the brothers organized a uprising against the police, the corner of Kercheval and Parkview right there. The police, it's a tactical mobile unit. They're stopping all cars that are coming into the neighborhood for the next 3 days. And they're going to find one car that has all these weapons in it. So somebody was bringing weapons to the area to help the rebellion. The 2 people are going to get arrested. They're going to go spend a small time in jail, but they're going to have a very long probation. The 2 people are General Baker and Glanton Dowdell. General Baker, of course, is going to be the founder of the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Glanton Dowdell is going to be the artist who will paint the Black Madonna mural inside of the Shrine of the Black Madonna Church. I ain't reading all that. But I can tell you the story. On June 23rd, 1967, 1 month before the 67 rebellion, Daniel Thomas and his wife, Louise Thomas, go celebrate at River Rouge Park. And he's returned from Vietnam. That's what they're celebrating. He's returning from Vietnam. He made it. He lived. And they go out to River Rouge Park, and they get chased out by a group of young white men. They wait a few hours, and Daniel Thomas like, they gone. Let's go back. And they go back. And they're there partying, and everything seems to be okay. And the guys show back up. And they chase them this time. And they're hiding behind a post at the recreation center. The recreation center is closed, so they can't get in the recreation center. But there's the post that hold up the front of it. So they're hiding behind the post because the boys are throwing bricks and bottles at them. And then the boys, well, they're not boys. They're actually all adults. And they say, we're going to rape her, kill her. And she's pregnant. And so Daniel Thomas comes out in front then. Look, don't mess with my wife. Leave her alone. And then they jump him, which was the plan. They wanted him to come out. And so they jump him. And he breaks away from them and pulls away. And he's shot 5 times in front of his wife, who will have a miscarriage. And in July 23rd, 1967, on the first day of the rebellion, no one's been arrested for killing Daniel Thomas. Nobody's been arrested for killing him yet. He lived 3 blocks away from where the rebellion started. So everybody in the neighborhood knows this story. He lived on Euclid. One of the people in the crowd said, y'all tells the police as they're bringing all the people outside of the illegal after hours bar. One of the people in the crowd says, y'all ain't arrest nobody for killing Danny Thomas. He hollers that to the police. Everybody in the crowd knows the story, and they remember it now, and they get mad again. What? Yeah, that's right. They ain't never arrest nobody. Now, eventually, they are going to arrest somebody. Michael Poslepeck, 23 years old, is going to get arrested. And he's going to tell on 5 other people who was with him. And those 5 other people are going to be brought to the station. Louise Thomas is going to be brought in to identify them. And she's going to be unable to identify those 5 people. And they're going to be released. Only Michael Poslepeck will go to trial for the killing of Daniel Thomas. And an all-white jury is going to find him not guilty. But nobody ever is going to go to prison for killing Daniel Thomas. Even though Michael Poslepeck not only confessed it himself, he told on 5 other people. There was a Black Power conference 3 weeks before the rebellion in the same neighborhood at the Shrine of the Black Madonna Church. It wasn't called that then. It was Central United Church of Christ then. And H. Rap Brown would give the final speech on the last day, and he would say, Motown, if you don't come around, we will burn you down. That's one of the statements from his speech. 3 weeks later, we have the 67 rebellion. Vivian Williams, who lived 2 blocks away. She didn't live 2 blocks away. She's going to get killed 2 blocks away from where the rebellion starts, on 12th and Hazelwood. The police believe, the people in the neighborhood believe it's the same thing that happened to Cynthia Scott. She was a prostitute. They tried to roll her, and she got killed. I'm not going to talk about all the Malcolm X history in the city of Detroit, but Malcolm X, of course, had been organizing with other Black Power activists in the city of Detroit, mainly Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., who was his friend, Milton and Richard Henry, who would go on and found the Republic of New Africa, and James and Grace Lee Boggs. That's him at the Detroit Free Press building. You didn't know the Nation of Islam was founded in the city of Detroit. And in 1954, early 1950s, they would buy this building from the Jewish Community Center, and that would be Mosque number 1 in the city of Detroit. Same neighborhood as the 67 Rebellion, right behind Central High School. There's Malcolm and his 2 brothers. That's Wilfred, who's the minister in Detroit. That's Filbert, who's the minister in Lansing. And then there's Malcolm. That's his wife, Betty Dean Sanders, Betty Shabazz, who was raised up in the city of Detroit, North End, graduated from Northern High School. That's Malcolm at Wayne State. That's Malcolm in that same neighborhood at King Solomon Baptist Church on 14th and Wabash. Marquette, 14th and Marquette. That's Malcolm. He gave this speech at King Solomon. Baptist Church, and he gave this speech the next year at King Solomon Baptist Church. Look at what he's saying. Be respectful, obey the law, be peaceful, but if someone puts their hand on you, send them to the cemetery. He gave that speech in the same neighborhood where the rebellion happened. They never have had a bloodless revolution or a nonviolent revolution. That don't even happen in Hollywood. You don't have a revolution in which you love your enemy, and you don't have a revolution in which you are begging the system of exploitation to integrate you into it. Revolutions overturn systems. Revolutions destroy systems. That's Malcolm X in 1964. He gives a speech in that same neighborhood. That's him giving the last speech in the city of Detroit, 1 week before he's assassinated. His house had got firebombed the night before. He was outside all night with a rifle and some underwear. So he was coughing when he came to the city of Detroit to give that speech in downtown Detroit. And so Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. told his brother-in-law, Gladys Clegg was married to a doctor. And so Gladys Clegg's husband is giving him this sedative. Hopefully it'll stop him from doing all that coughing so he could give his speech. And so that man who's giving the sedative, that's Dr. Evans. You may not know Dr. E. Evans, but you know his son, Warren Evans, who is the Wayne County executive, the former Wayne County sheriff, and the former chief of police in the city of Detroit. That's his daddy giving the shot to Malcolm X. Dr. Warren Evans grew up in the Shrine of the Black Madonna. His uncle is Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. That's his uncle. Look who's on this. This is the speech. The invocation is Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., who's going to be the founder of the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Ziggy Johnson is the master of ceremonies. George Bashara gives the greetings from Governor Romney. You don't know George Bashara Jr., but you know his son, Mike Bashara, who killed his wife a few years ago and left the car over in the black neighborhood to get black people to be blamed for it. That's his daddy. Who else is here? Dorothy Ashby, Clarence Sherrill, John Ashby, Attorney Milton Henry, one of the founders of the Republic of New Africa. He's going to be Gaidi Obedelli. His brother Richard is going to be Imari Obedelli. There's Brazil Denard, the choral leader, who's also here. Charles Howard, George White, William V. Banks is going to be the founder of WGPR, the first black TV station in America. And look at Rosa Parks right there. Rosa Parks was a friend and supporter of Malcolm X. We think of her as this timid lady who refused to give up her seat. She was a supporter of the Black Power movement. And of course, El Hajj Malik Shabazz is going to give the main speech. Almost done. That's Hugh Clegg, Reverend Albert Clegg's brother. Anybody want to take a guess at who she is? That's Grace Lee Boggs. It's Grace Lee Boggs. The founders of the Freedom Now Party, who came to give 5 minutes, who came and gave a fundraising speech for them? Malcolm X. Now we at the spot. This was not an illegal after-hours bar. You've always heard that, and the reason you've heard it that way is because it orients your mind to think about it a certain way. Because if you hear that an illegal after-hours bar is being raided, well, that sounds like it's supposed to happen. Illegal after-hours bar, police raided. Why folks mad? But it was not an illegal after-hours bar. It's right there. That's the membership card. United Community League for Civic Action, 9125 12th Street. That's what the organization is. It's a political organization. They are registering people to vote in that neighborhood. It's not an illegal after-hours bar. It's a political organization. The legal after-hours bar activity is fundraising for the political activity. It is as much, if not more, political than it is the illegal after-hours bar. You always hear about the one, and you never hear about the other, because you are supposed to think about it a certain way. Now, if you had heard that it was a political organization being raided, that would change everything you thought about what happened on that night on July 23rd, 1967. But you never hear that, but now you did. That's the membership card to get in. Chuck Henry, the officer, does not have one of those membership cards, so he can't get in on that Saturday night. He slides in on Sunday morning because a group of beautiful women have shown up to a party for 2 returned Vietnam War veterans at the club. And they're coming in, and Chuck Henry positions himself as if he's a member of their party. If you know anything about clubs, you know that beautiful women don't have to have no membership card to get in the club. And so he just acted like he was one of them, or he was with them, and that's how he got in. Once he's in, he's there for 10 minutes, and he buys a beer, and they raid the place. That's the front door that they axe down. They take an axe and axe down the front door. This is the young man who's leading the crowd who's leading the group to say, we ain't letting y'all do this. Y'all always messing with us. Y'all ain't arrest nobody for killing Danny Thomas. His name is Michael Lewis. The police call him Green Sleeve because he's wearing a long sleeve green shirt in this 80-degree weather. And so they try to come get him. And as they get the last person in the squad car, because there's 80 people in this place. That's why it takes them so long. That's why the crowd is able to grow so big, because it's taking them so long to get all these people out of this club. A crowd is growing and growing and growing. And this guy is getting the crowd even more upset. And so they say, after they get the last person, we got to get this guy. And they go towards him. And when they go towards him, this guy is in the crowd. Bill Walter Scott III, the son of the owner of the club. And he got bricks. And the minute they start going towards Michael Lewis, he unleashes his bricks. Once he unleashes his, everybody else start picking up bricks and bottles too. The police have to leave. They have to retreat. They can't get Michael Lewis. They can't get Bill Scott. They can't get nobody after the last person they put in that car. They get them out of there. They come back later with reinforcements. When they come back with reinforcements, the community has come back with reinforcements. And that is the beginning of the 1967 rebellion. That's how it starts. The first stores that get looted are the stores that the people consider the stores that mistreat, rob them of their money, are racist. That's the first stores that get looted. And the police are standing there doing nothing because they're scared. There's too many people to do something about it. And so the people say, well, they're not even doing nothing. So let's go steal something from the other stores. And they start stealing from stores that aren't the bad stores. People in the community hear about that and start coming up to the other stores and try to protect some of the other stores. They can't protect them all, but they try to. And Governor Romney is going to issue a curfew. He's going to send the Michigan National Guard and the Michigan State Police that night. And some of the people protecting stores are going to get arrested on curfew violations. That's the end of protecting stores, except for the owners. Nobody in the community is going to take a risk at getting shot by one of those 50 caliber guns from the National Guard just trying to protect a store. So except for the owners of the stores, people are not doing that no more. That's how it's a rebellion. It didn't start out with just trying to burn down every store. Second day of the rebellion, Joe Nelson will paint this white Jesus at the Sacred Heart Major Seminary. He will paint it black. He doesn't participate in the looting or the burning, but he does participate in the rebellion. Eventually, after a number of times of it being repainted white by whites, the church is going to keep it black to show their solidarity with the African American community. And it's still kept black to this day. Ed Vaughn's bookstore, you might not call it a rebellion, but there were police who definitely thought it was a rebellion because they're going to burn down Ed Vaughn's bookstore on the third day of the rebellion because they believe that's where the militants were organizing. So they're going to burn down the black bookstore in the city of Detroit at 12123 Dexter. So the police who shot out all of the street lights, the police and National Guard, shot out all the street lights. They're also going to burn down Ed Vaughn's bookstore because it was a militant organizing place and they considered it, they believed that it was real militants who were organizing this whole thing. And they were meeting at Vaughn's bookstore. And so they burned down his bookstore. And of course, on that same day, early that morning, Tanya Blanding, 4 years old, will be killed by the National Guard. National Guard shot out all the street lights. And so anytime they saw a light, they said they thought it was a sniper or claimed they thought it was a sniper. And when someone lights a cigarette in an apartment building on 1756 Euclid, the National Guard unleashed 50 caliber bullets onto the building, going through the wall, shooting off the arm of one of the ladies living there and killing her 4-year-old niece, Tanya Blanding. That's her funeral at Central United Church of Christ, which of course is going to be the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And the pastor who's going to give her eulogy is Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. And we know later that night, the police are going to raid the Algiers Motel. And before they leave, 3 black teenagers will be dead and 9 other people will be tortured in that building. And the film does not tell it. I don't even want to talk about the film right now, but the film is ahistorical. And maybe at some other point, I'll be able to talk to you about the film. Those are the 3 young men who will be killed. Carl Cooper, 17 years old. Fred Temple, 18 years old. And Aubrey Pollard, 19 years old. They will be killed by 3 officers, David Sinek, Robert Pale, and Ronald August. David Sinek, within the 5 days of the rebellion, will be involved in the shooting of 6 people, 5 of which are going to die. And David Sinek is in the film. That's Officer Krause, played by Will Poulter, the sadistic racist in that film, Detroit, if you saw that film. Who saw that film? So if you saw that film, Detroit, the sadistic racist is Krause. That's really David Sinek. None of the officers have their real names. All the victims have their real names in the film. And this man, Daniel Aldridge, my friend, will organize a people's tribunal on August 30th, 1967, where the people will have a trial of the officers and the security guard, Melvin Dismukes, the black security guard, played by John Boyega. In the film, he's a hero. He's trying to help people. In real life, he beat 3 people up in the Algiers motel. And so they're going to testify at the People's Tribunal at Central United Church of Christ at the Shrine of the Black Madonna. There's 2,000 people in the church at the trial. Doesn't even get mentioned in the film. Who's on the jury? John Killens, the author. Frank Joyce, the white radical activist. Rosa Parks is on the jury. And of course, black people and others are held in Belle Isle, in the women's changing rooms as a detention center. No police report, no charges. They're held incognito. Nobody even knows they exist. Their parents and family members think they're dead. And then days after the rebellion, they come home and their parents like, what? Where is you coming from? They've been held on buses and every kind of other place. So 67 was a rebellion. It was started as a community uprising against police brutality, a part of a larger ongoing tradition of racism against black Detroiters. Some people still see it as a riot. That's understandable from a certain vantage point. It has some validity, but some problems. Although racial tension was definitely the cause of the 1967 rebellion, it was not a race riot. We had a race riot and a rebellion. We had people had to defend themselves for trying to get into their homes. We had the 43 race riot there and the 66 planned rebellion. We had 67. Then there was even a small uprising after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It lasted for about 1 day. Then in 1969, there was a shootout at New Bethel Baptist Church when the Republic of New Africa shot 2 police officers who tried to raid their meeting. And this, of course, was in conjunction with the FBI's COINTELPRO program to up the ante on black militant organizations. That was March of 1969. On December 1969, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark are going to get killed in Chicago. Remember, the leaders of the Chicago Black Panther Party, but they tried it first in Detroit. And so some organizations that come out of 1967 is Focus Hope. The Wayne County Community College District comes out of 1967. New Detroit comes out of 1967. The Shrine of the Black Madonna, that church is going to come out of 1967. And Operation Get Down on the east side of the city of Detroit is going to come out of 1967. And of course, the election of Coleman Young is connected to the rebellion in 1967. When he's elected, there are 3,930 complaints of police brutality in the city of Detroit. Within 6 years of him being mayor, the number of complaints are 845, which is still bad. But 845 is not 3,930 because of his radical plan of integrating the Detroit Police Department. So many African Americans and people who live in the city of Detroit become police officers. It changes the level of brutality against African Americans. Thank you for listening as long as you have.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So much information. I'm sure everyone here learned.
Yes. I just want to apologize for going so long because I always like to have some questions or comments, and but there's some things I just wanted to make sure I said, but I do apologize for that. But thank you for staying. I know some people couldn't stay, but those who did and chose to, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.